Hello, and welcome back to this episode of the Rekindling the Legacy podcast. I'm Dr. Juhi Gupta.
And I am Professor Andrew Davis.
And together we are here to retell the stories of some of the heroic women who fought for their freedom against all the odds and made India the nation it is today.
We are coming to you courtesy of the Inclusive Futures Foundation. We are an Indian NGO that works on education, on healthcare, on the environment, on women and children's rights, and on culture. And you can find out a lot more about what we do by visiting our website, theinclusivefuturesfoundation.com.
So many thanks to you for joining us on what we hope will be an inspirational journey through the lives and experiences of some of the underestimated, often unacknowledged pioneering women who shaped Indian history. Andrew, who are we meeting today?
Well, today, Juhi, we're going to talk about a woman who chose death over defeat, who built an army from nothing, who waged guerrilla warfare against the British Empire in the hills of central India. Her name was Rani Avanti Bai Lodhi, and her story is one of the most remarkable chapters of the 1857 rebellion that most people have probably never heard.
Avanti Bai was born on August 16, 1831, in Mankehandi village, in what's now the Sioni district of Madhya Pradesh. Her father was Jujhar Singh, a zamidar, essentially a landowner, with administrative and military responsibilities in the area. She came from a Rajput Lodhi family, which meant she was born into a warrior tradition that valued military skill and courage above almost everything else. And from the very beginning, it was clear that Avanti Bai was exceptional. While most girls of that era were being prepared for domestic life, she was learning archery, horsemanship, and swordmanship. She studied military strategy and statecraft. Her family recognized that she had both the intelligence and the temperament to be a leader, and they gave her the education she would need.
At a young age, she married Vikramaditya Singh Lodhi, the son of Raja Lakshmana Singh of Ramgarh. This wasn't just a personal alliance, it was a political marriage that connected two important families in the region. When Raja Lakshmana Singh died in 1850, Vikramaditya became the ruler of Ramgarh and Avanti Bai became his queen. But here's what makes her story so different from that of many other royal women of that era. Avanti Bai didn't just serve as a ceremonial consort. When her husband became ill, she took over the actual administration of the kingdom. She was making military decisions, managing finances, conducting diplomacy with neighbouring rulers. She was, in every practical sense, the ruler of Ramgarh. And this is where her story intersects with one of the most destructive policies of British colonial rule, the doctrine of lapse.
We have encountered this doctrine of lapse a few times already in our podcast, but just to remind you, the doctrine of lapse was introduced by Lord Dalhousie, and it was basically a legal mechanism for the British to steal kingdoms. The policy stated that if a ruler died without a biological heir, his kingdom would be automatically annexed by the British East India Company. It didn't matter if the ruler had adopted sons or if his widow was perfectly capable of ruling. Without a biological heir, the kingdom was forfeit. This policy was devastating to Indian royalty because adoption was a common and acceptable practice. Many rulers who couldn't have biological children would adopt heirs and train them to rule. But the British didn't recognize these adoptions.
When her husband Vikramaditya Singh died, Avanti Bai found herself in exactly this situation. She had two sons, Aman Singh and Sher Singh, but they were still minors, and the British refused to recognise them as heirs to the throne. So, according to the doctrine of lapse, Ramgarh would therefore be annexed by the East India Company. Indeed, the British installed a British-approved administrator named Sheikh Mohammed to run Ramgarh. Just like that, Avanti Bai went from being a ruling queen to being a dispossessed widow. Her kingdom was stolen, her authority was eliminated, and she was expected to accept this humiliation quietly.
But Avanti Bai was not the type of person who accepted humiliation quietly. For a time, she watched as British administration ran her kingdom, imposed British policies on her people, and treated her former subjects as colonial subjects rather than citizens of an independent state. And then in May of 1857, she heard news that changed everything. The rebellion had begun. It started on May 10th in Meerut when Indian soldiers in the British Army mutinied over the infamous cartridge controversy. The rebellion spread rapidly across northern and central India, and by May, the news had reached Avanti Bai in her exile.
This was the moment she'd been waiting for. Finally, there was a coordinated uprising against British rule. Finally, she had a chance to fight back against the system that had stolen her kingdom and humiliated her people. Her response was swift and decisive. She used her knowledge of local politics and her network of family connections to build a coalition against the British. She began sending messages to neighbouring rulers and chieftains, calling on them to join the rebellion. In fact, she famously sent glass bangles along with a letter to local kings and landlords from the neighbouring states, writing in the letter, "Either tighten your waist to protect the motherland or sit at home wearing glass bangles. You should fulfill the oath to your religion." People responded to her call, and impressively she managed to raise an army of some 4,000 soldiers. Remember, this was a woman who'd been out of power for 6 years, who had no official position, who'd been relegated to the sidelines by British policy. And yet she was able to convince 4,000 men to follow her into battle against what was then the most powerful military force in the world. That kind of leadership ability is extraordinary by any measure.
Her first major engagement with British forces was in Khairi village in the Mandala district, and she won. Her army defeated a British force and proved that the company's military wasn't invincible. This victory was hugely significant, but it demonstrated to people throughout the region that the British could be beaten. But the British weren't going to let this challenge go unanswered. They sent a larger force to attack Ramgarh and crush Avanti Bai's rebellion once and for all. When this force arrived, Avanti Bai made a brilliant tactical decision. Instead of trying to defend a fixed position against a superior force, she withdrew to the Devharigarh hill.
And here in those hills is where she demonstrated the full extent of her military genius. The hills gave her the perfect terrain for guerrilla warfare. She could strike British positions and then disappear into terrain that she knew intimately, but that was unfamiliar to British forces. The British sent General Waddington to hunt her down, thinking that a conventional military operation would be more than enough to capture or kill a mere woman rebel. But they had no idea what they were dealing with. Avanti Bai's campaign in the hills was a masterclass in guerrilla warfare. She would strike British camps at night, ambush supply convoys, and then vanish before the British could mount any sort of counterattack. She used her knowledge of local terrain to stay one step ahead of the much larger British forces. And indeed, her final attack on General Waddington's camp was a perfectly coordinated assault that was the crowning achievement of this campaign. It was such a devastating defeat for the British that it completely destroyed Waddington's position and forced him to retreat. For a moment, it looked like this remarkable woman might actually succeed in driving the British out of her region. She was just 26.
But guerrilla warfare, even when it's brilliantly executed, has its limitations. Avanti Bai was fighting a war of attrition against an empire that had vastly superior resources. Her forces were exhausted, her supplies were running low, and she was increasingly isolated as other parts of the 1857 rebellion were crushed by British counterattacks. But by early 1858, she must have realized that she couldn't win a prolonged war against the British Empire. Her army was scattered, her allies were defeated, and she was being hunted by overwhelming numbers of British troops.
And so on March the 20th, 1858, facing certain capture by British forces, Rani Avanti Bai chose death over defeat and took her own life so that her capture could not cause shame or discouragement to the freedom movement. She became, in that moment, a martyr to the cause of Indian independence, proving that some principles are more important than personal survival. And yes, her death marked the end of the rebellion in her region, but it also created a legend that would inspire future generations of freedom fighters. She had proven that the British Empire wasn't invincible, that a determined leader could challenge even the most powerful colonial forces, and that the spirit of resistance could never be completely crushed.
As we always like to conclude our biographies by asking and answering a simple question: what was her legacy? In other words, what difference did her life make? What are the lessons we should learn from her? How can she inspire us? So, Andrew, what would you say about Rani Avanti Bai?
So, Juhi, what strikes me most about her story is how it challenges our assumptions about the 1857 rebellion, the first war of independence. We often think of it as primarily a military uprising led by male soldiers and rulers. But women like Avanti Bai played crucial roles as political leaders, military commanders, and strategic thinkers. She wasn't just fighting alongside men, she was leading men. She wasn't just supporting the rebellion, she was commanding armies and making strategic decisions that affected the entire course of the uprising in this part of India. So her story also shows us something important about the nature of colonial resistance. The British didn't just face opposition from famous figures like Rani Lakshmibai or Tatya Tope. They faced resistance from dozens of local rulers and leaders who had their own grievances, their own strategies, and for that matter, their own vision of what an independent India should look like. And yes, Avanti Bai's rebellion was part of this larger pattern of resistance. But what made her exceptional was her ability to turn personal grievance into effective military action. She didn't just resent British rule, she built an army to fight it.
When India finally gained independence in 1947, the government recognized the importance of leaders like Rani Avanti Bai. They named part of Burgi Dam projects in Jabalpur in her honor and issued commemorative stamps in 1988 and 2001 to mark her contribution to the independence struggle. But even today, her story remains relatively unknown compared to more famous figures from the 1857 rebellion. This is partly because her campaign was fought in a relatively remote area, and partly because the documentation of her activities is limited compared to figures who operated in major cities or left extensive written records. It's also, I think, because her story doesn't fit neatly into some of our popular narratives about the 1857 rebellion. She wasn't a tragic victim like some of the stories we tell about women in that period. She wasn't just a supporting character in someone else's drama. She was a military commander who built an army, won battles, and chose her own death on her own terms. That kind of agency and power is sometimes uncomfortable for narratives that prefer to see women of that era as either victims or symbols rather than as active participants who made their own strategic decisions. But Rani Avanti Bai was very much an active participant who made her own decisions.
Well, that brings us to the end of another episode. What a remarkable woman Rani Avanti Bai was, and her story is inspirational, impactful, and hopefully uplifting for us today as well. So thank you so much for joining us. We hope you'll join us again for the next episode when we tell the story of another remarkable Indian woman freedom fighter. To make sure you don't miss an episode, please do like this video and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. We look forward to seeing you again soon.